Hello sewers and welcome. I'm Debbie from Sew Simple Bags. Today I want to talk about quilted fabric. Quilted fabric is a great material to use for your bag making. It makes your bags sturdy and gives them some really nice volume and helps your bag to stand up and be strong. And at the same time, it's kind of padded and soft too. It really is the best of both worlds, and it's a fantastic fabric to use for creating bags. However, if you look in the fabric stores online, you'll see that there's not an awful lot of choice for pre-quilted fabrics. So the best thing to do absolutely is to make your own. And it's really not that difficult. We're going to sew up a big piece of quilted fabric in just a few minutes. What you will need is your regular quilting fabric. I've just got a piece of quilting cotton here in a nice bright design. You'll also need fusible fleece. I prefer to use fusible fleece because it's something that you've probably already got in your bag sewing supplies. It's got glue on one side, it's nice and soft and fleecy and a little bit padded, and it's not so difficult to work with as if you were using quilt batting. Now if you are a quilter, of course, then of course go ahead, you've got quilt batting in your supplies, go ahead and use it, but no doubt you probably don't need this tutorial about how to make quilted fabric. So this video is really aimed at those who want to sew bags. So first thing to do is to fuse your fusible fleece to your fabric. Now you might think, why is that the first thing to do? Why would we not cut our pattern pieces? And this is something that's really important, and I recommend that you always quilt your fabric first before cutting out your fabric pieces to use in your bag making. So you can either take your pattern piece and maybe cut your fabric around an inch larger on all sides, or add up all your pattern pieces and think, right, I need a half a yard of fabric, or I need a yard of fabric, or I need a fat quarter, and then you quilt that fat quarter in advance before cutting your pattern pieces. The reason being, when we quilt fabric, it tends to pucker up a little bit, and that's the whole point of the quilting process. It creates the lumps and bumps, the volume in the fabric, and gives it that soft and quilted appearance, but at the same time it actually shrinks that fabric in a little bit. So if you've gone ahead and cut your pattern pieces and then you quilt the fabric, you're going to find out that your pattern pieces are now potentially a little bit too small. So I've made a piece of fabric this size, which is going to be large enough, plus a little bit more for the bag that I'm making. And on the back, I've fused my piece of fusible fleece. So we're now ready to quilt. If you are a beginner, definitely the easiest thing to do is going to be to quilt straight lines, because you're used to sewing straight lines all the time. So quilting a straight line is going to be just the same. Then again, there are two ways. Let's deal with it first of all in terms of marking your fabric. Now you can create whatever design you want on your fabric. I'm going to make diamonds on mine. So I'm going to start from one point over here to the other point. Let's get my specs on so I can actually see the points. There we go. And using a fabric marker, I'm just going to draw a line on my fabric here. And that is my starting line. Now, because I want it to be diagonal, I'm also going to draw across the other diagonal of my fabric. So that now gives me my center mark, and it gives me my two diagonal lines here to use. Now, there are two ways that you can go from here. If you have one of these, let me just pop my piece of fleece down there so I can put the foot on top. This strange looking thing is a quilting guide. Have a look. This is the side view. This is the bottom here. It will sit on your machine in this way. And then we have this long bar that goes across here that actually fits into your sewing machine presser foot. Mine works with my walking foot, but also on the drop down bar, the bar here at the back where my presser foot connect, there's also a little hole in there, and this little quilting guide will fit so that I can work it with any of my sewing feet. Therefore, I don't need a different foot. I will just use my regular machine foot to do my quilting, but this one will help guide me. We will take a closer look at this when I actually take the fabric over to the machine and start the stitching. But if you have one of these, then you don't need to mark any more lines on your fabric, because your quilting guide foot here will help you with that. If you don't have one of those feet, then you will need to mark some lines on your fabric. So then it's up to you to decide. Maybe you would want your lines, let's say, maybe 1.5 inches apart, 1 inch apart, 1/2 inch apart. It depends on you and the kind of design that you want to create, and also to some extent the scale of the bag that you're making. If you're making a larger bag, then you can afford to use a larger distance between your quilted lines. With a little small bag, if you have large lines between your quilting distances, then on a small scale bag you won't have a lot of quilting, and it'd probably be better to do small lines, say 3/4 inch. So for this one, let's see, probably, let's turn my ruler around, probably 1 inch looks as though it would be a good distance. So if I didn't have that foot, I would now go from these lines that I've already drawn, draw my next one 1 inch away, move the ruler over, draw the next one 1 inch away, and I would have to mark all of the lines on my fabric in order to follow them when I was doing the quilting. Because I have this little quilting attachment here, this little guide attachment, I only need to mark one line in each direction, and my quilting guide is going to deal with that for me. No guide, then I'm afraid you're down to drawing all of the lines. So my fabric piece is ready. Let's take it over to the sewing machine. So first I'll install the little quilting guide into my machine there. It's a little bit of a tight fit. The reason being, it has to be stiff, because once the guide is there in place, we need it to not move. It needs to stay there so that we can sew an accurate line. We're not going to use it for our first pass. I'm going to follow this line through the center of my fabric here. So let's get the fabric under the sewing machine. Set a regular stitch length. And now I can see my center line going from one diagonal to the other, and I'm just going to sew through that line as if I were just sewing a regular seam. I don't need to worry about back stitching at the start or the end, because the fabric is going to be used with our fabric, with our pattern templates, and these ends are all just going to be cut off anyway, so we don't have to worry about those. Keep things kind of tidy. You can throw away and trim your threads if you like. So now I've done one, I'm going to go from the opposite corner, from here to here, and sew my other diagonal. So if you don't have the quilting guide, all you now continue to do is to follow all of the lines that you have drawn on your fabric, your guidelines, and then follow in both directions out from the center like this until you have your whole piece sewn and quilted. For me, with the quilting guide, I now need to set the position of my guide. We decided that 1 inch would be a good distance for quilting this fabric. So what I now need to do is to take my measure or a small ruler over to the sewing machine, see where my needle falls, and then set my quilt guide at 1 inch away from my needle. Just a little more. That looks good. Just a fraction. and I'm going to put the fabric through the machine again, and this time as I do so I'm going to make sure that the quilting guide here is actually right on the line of stitching that I've already done. Let's move that into the machine. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to see from my camera angle, but I hope so. But here I have my line of original stitching, and here is my quilting guide, and here is my needle, and it's going to sew a line 1 inch to the left, providing my quilting guide follows this line of stitching through the machine. So instead of keeping my eye on the needle, I'm actually keeping my eye on the quilting guide and making sure that follows the stitches. If you have a larger piece of fabric, you may need to roll or fold your fabric a little bit to get it through the throat of your machine just here. So here is my second line of stitching, and it's perfectly parallel to my first line of stitching. Hooray for the win! Now we just continue on doing exactly the same, following the quilting guide. That quilting guide will now go on this second line of stitching, and as I sew I'll get a line parallel to that, and so on until I've worked my way all the way across my fabric. Then I turn into the other direction, again set the quilting line through the middle line and move out. So let's take it over and do another line. It's really quite relaxing. Do make sure that you have plenty of thread on your bobbin, because this is quite thread intensive. We're going to have sewn quite a lot of stitches by the time we've finished the whole sheet, and you don't want to be sewing away merrily only to pick it up and find that you've run out of bobbin thread. So keep an eye on that while you're sewing your project. So I'm going to carry on and quilt across this in both directions, and we'll take a look at it when it's finished. So at last my sewing is done and my quilted fabric is finished, and it feels kind of nice. I've used a nice bright orange thread on top, and the contrast with the fabric underneath looks fantastic. The quilting guide helped me to keep my lines nice and even, and so it looks pretty good. I'm happy with it. So it really is that easy, just to make yourself a piece of quilted fabric at home to use in your sewing bags and other projects. I'm now going to use this piece to create a custom tool roll, and I have a sewing tutorial to help you design your own custom tool roll, which you can use for crochet hooks, pens, sewing supplies, knitting needles, a crayon roll for kids, brushes for your cosmetics brushes, anything like that that you want to store in a roll-up caddy. Then look out for the tutorial on my YouTube channel for that one. Thanks for watching. See you here again soon.